My name is Charles Whitman. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life I've been someone people describe as solid, not exciting, not dramatic, just solid. I work in operations management, one of those behind-the-scenes roles where things only get noticed when they go wrong. In my family, I've always been seen the same way: capable, calm, self-sufficient. The one who doesn't complain. The one who will land on his feet no matter what. That perception followed me for years, and for a long time I accepted it without question. If you asked my parents to describe me, they'd probably say I was independent from a young age. Mature, easy to raise. I didn't ask for much. I didn't push back. I didn't create problems that needed solving. Compared to my sibling, who was louder, more expressive, and more visibly in need of support, I seemed fine. And fine, I learned, is often mistaken for doesn't need help. I'm sharing this story not to stir anger or collect sympathy. There's no shouting in it, no revenge, no moment where I finally tell everyone off and walk away feeling triumphant. This is a quieter story than that. It's about clarity, about the slow realization that love, even when it's genuine, is often expressed through priorities. And those priorities don't always line up with what we hope they will be. This story centers on one particular moment, but it didn't start there. The moment came when I was facing medical bills I genuinely couldn't cover on my own. I asked my parents for help, not casually, not dramatically, just honestly. They said they couldn't, that it wasn't possible, that they had to be careful. And I believed them. That same week they bought my brother a brand new car. No announcement, no explanation, just a fact that surfaced quietly, almost accidentally. And in that moment, something settled into place for me. Not rage, not heartbreak, just understanding. Priorities became painfully clear. What follows isn't about blame. My parents weren't cruel people. They didn't set out to hurt me. In their minds, they were being practical, even fair. My sibling didn't steal anything from me. They accepted what was offered, just as I had accepted what wasn't. This story is about how those dynamics form, and what happens when the person who's always expected to adjust finally stops doing so. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through how I was seen in my family, how small moments of dismissal stacked up over time, and how silence, something I once used to keep the peace, slowly became a deliberate choice. You'll hear about decisions made quietly, without confrontation, and consequences that unfolded without anyone fully understanding why. I'm not here to dramatize my pain or vilify anyone else. I'm here to tell the truth as clearly as I can, from my perspective, without exaggeration. Because sometimes the most defining moments in our lives aren't the loud ones. They're the ones we almost miss. So before we continue, I want to ask you something, honestly and without judgment. Have you ever realized that being the strong one in a family sometimes comes at a cost no one ever acknowledges? For as long as I can remember, I was the easy one. That wasn't a title anyone formally gave me. It was something implied, reinforced quietly over the years. I was the child who didn't need reminders. The teenager who handled his own schedule. The adult who didn't ask for help unless absolutely necessary. When something went wrong, I was expected to adapt. When something went right, it was assumed that I would. In my family, reliability became my defining trait, and over time, it replaced curiosity about who I actually was. My parents often spoke about me with a kind of relieved pride. Charles has always been so independent, they'd say. We never had to worry about him. At first, I took that as a compliment. Independence sounds like strength when you're young. It feels like proof that you're capable, that you're doing life correctly. What I didn't realize then was that independence, once labeled, can turn into an excuse, an explanation for absence, a reason not to look too closely. My brother occupied a different space in the family. He wasn't difficult, but he was expressive. His emotions were visible. When he struggled, it was obvious. When he needed something, it was heard. Conversations bent around his needs naturally, not because anyone consciously favored him, but because his presence demanded response. Mine didn't. I learned early that calm was rewarded, that being low maintenance kept the household balanced. When decisions were made, they often came with the assumption that I would adjust without friction. And I did. Not because I was asked to, but because it felt like the responsible thing to do. There were moments, small ones, that hinted at this dynamic. If plans changed suddenly, I was the one expected to understand. If resources were limited, I was the one assumed to be fine waiting. When attention shifted elsewhere, I told myself it didn't matter. And for a long time, I believed that. I told myself that my parents trusted me more, that they knew I could handle things, that their focus on my brother was situational, temporary, and justified. I didn't frame it as neglect. I framed it as efficiency. If someone needs less, you give them less. That logic felt reasonable, until it became personal. As I got older, the pattern stayed consistent. When I graduated, the celebration was quiet. When I got my first stable job, it was acknowledged, then quickly absorbed into the assumption that I was set. When I moved cities for work, there were no long conversations about whether I was okay. It was simply accepted that I would be. I rarely shared when I felt overwhelmed. Part of that was pride, part of it was habit, and part of it was an unspoken understanding that expressing need would feel out of character, almost inappropriate. So I didn't. From the outside, it probably looked like I had everything under control. And in many ways, I did. But control isn't the same as being supported, and strength, when it's expected rather than chosen, slowly turns into isolation. Looking back now, I can see that I wasn't invisible. I was predictable. And predictability made it easy for others to overlook the moments when I needed something different. At the time, though, I didn't name it. I didn't resent it. I simply accepted the role I had been given. The reliable one. The steady one. The one who would make it work. I had no idea how expensive that role would eventually become. The first time I noticed it, I almost dismissed it. That's the strange thing about small moments. They rarely announce themselves as important. They arrive quietly, wrapped in reasonable explanations. And if you're someone who's learned to minimize your own reactions, they're easy to file away as misunderstandings. At the time, I was in my late 20s and had just started a new role. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered to me. I'd worked hard to get there, taken extra certifications on my own time, and moved into a position that finally felt like progress rather than maintenance. I remember calling my parents to share the news, not expecting celebration, just acknowledgement. They were pleased, politely so. My mother said she was proud of me. My father asked a few practical questions about benefits and stability. Then within minutes, the conversation shifted. My brother was considering a career change and was unsure about his next steps. The tone changed immediately, more engaged, more concerned. Suggestions were offered, reassurances given. Time stretched. I told myself it was nothing. He was uncertain, I wasn't. Of course, they focused on him, but something lingered. It wasn't jealousy. It was the faint sense that my milestones were treated as conclusions, while his were treated as crossroads. When I succeeded, it closed a chapter. When he struggled, it opened a discussion. That pattern repeated in subtle ways. When my brother needed help moving apartments, my parents rearranged their schedules. When I moved cities for work a year later, I handled it myself. No one offered to come along. No one asked if I wanted help. It was assumed I didn't need it, and I didn't challenge that assumption. Another time, I mentioned casually that I'd been dealing with persistent back pain. Nothing dramatic, just something that had been affecting my sleep. My father nodded, said, "You've always had a high pain tolerance," and moved on. A week later, my brother mentioned feeling burnt out, and suddenly there were discussions about taking time off, about stress, about self-care. Again, I told myself I was reading too much into it. I became very good at explaining things away. They're just worried about him. He needs more support right now. I'm better at handling things, it's fine. But each explanation came at a cost I didn't yet recognize. Every time I minimized myself, I reinforced the role they already saw me in. The one who doesn't need, the one who copes, the one who will be okay regardless. What made it harder to name was that none of it felt malicious. There were no cruel words, no deliberate exclusion, just a steady imbalance of attention and concern that was easy to overlook if you weren't the one living inside it. I remember one specific dinner, a family gathering where conversation flowed easily. My brother talked about his plans, his doubts, and his frustrations. Everyone listened. I shared something small about a project I was proud of, and the table nodded politely before the conversation drifted elsewhere. It wasn't intentional. No one interrupted me. No one dismissed me outright. They just didn't stay. That was the first time I felt the cut. Not sharp, not deep, but precise. A realization that my experiences didn't invite curiosity the way his did. That my stability made me less interesting, less urgent. I went home that night and didn't feel angry. I felt oddly quiet, as if I'd noticed a rule I hadn't known existed before. From then on, I became more selective about what I shared, not out of spite, but out of instinct. If something wouldn't be met with interest or care, it felt easier to keep it to myself. I framed it as maturity, privacy, independence. In reality, it was an adaptation, and everyone around me seemed relieved by it. The first small cut didn't hurt because of what was taken away. It hurt because it taught me something, that my needs, when expressed calmly, were easy to overlook. That being reasonable made me less visible. And that once people learn you won't ask for much, they stop offering altogether. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change anything outwardly. I simply adjusted, quietly, the way I always had. I had no idea then that this adjustment would become a habit, and that habits, left unexamined, eventually shape entire relationships. By the time I noticed the pattern clearly, it had already become familiar enough to feel normal. That's how it works, I think. Disrespect doesn't usually arrive as a declaration. It settles in gradually, disguised as practicality, framed as circumstance, softened by good intentions. And when you're someone who's learned to stay composed, to give others the benefit of the doubt, you end up helping it take root. After that first small cut, I didn't withdraw completely. I just recalibrated. I shared less. I expected less. And because nothing visibly broke, everyone, including me, assumed things were fine. When holidays came around, my brother's schedule always shaped the plans. If he could make it, dates were adjusted. If he couldn't, discussions stretched on, looking for alternatives. My availability, on the other hand, was treated as flexible by default. If I couldn't come, it was accepted quickly, almost efficiently, as if my absence required less emotional accounting. At the time, I told myself it made sense. I didn't have kids. I didn't have complications. I could adapt. I always had. When money came up, the contrast became clearer, though still subtle. My parents occasionally helped my brother with unexpected expenses, repairs, shortfalls, transitions between jobs. It was never framed as favoritism. It was always just for now, until things stabilize, because he needs it more at the moment. When I had expenses, I didn't bring them up. Not because they didn't exist, but because I'd internalized the idea that mentioning them would feel disproportionate. Like asking for assistance would somehow contradict the image of competence everyone relied on. So I absorbed the cost, financially, emotionally, quietly. What made it easier to accept was that no one ever told me directly that my needs mattered less. That would have been easier to push back against. Instead, the message was implied through repetition. Through whom was it checked on? Who was followed up with? Who received reassurance without asking? Over time, I began to preemptively downplay my own difficulties. If someone asked how I was doing, I'd say, busy but good. If something was hard, I framed it as manageable. I stopped mentioning discomfort unless it reached a level that interfered with basic functioning. Part of me believed I was being considerate. Another part believed I was being realistic. But beneath that was something else, a quiet understanding that expressing need didn't change outcomes, it only created awkwardness. I didn't want to be the one who disrupted the balance. My brother, meanwhile, didn't do anything wrong. He spoke honestly about his struggles. He asked questions. He accepted help when it was offered. The difference wasn't in his behavior, it was in how it was received. And because he received care, he continued to express need. Because I didn't, I stopped. This dynamic wasn't discussed. It didn't need to be. It lived in the spaces between conversations, in the assumptions people made before anyone said a word. I remember one phone call in particular. I'd been working long hours, dealing with stress that I didn't yet have language for. My mother asked how things were going. I hesitated, just a second longer than usual, before answering honestly that I was tired. That work had been heavier than expected. There was a pause, but then she said, "Well, at least you're good at handling pressure. You've always been strong like that." It was meant as praise. I thanked her, and that was the end of it. No follow-up question, no curiosity, just a neat conclusion drawn around my experience. Strength, once again, was used to close the conversation rather than open it. That was when I realized something important. My calmness had become a kind of currency. It kept things smooth, predictable, comfortable. For everyone but me, and the longer I maintained it, the more it was expected. I wasn't being actively disrespected in a dramatic sense. I was being quietly deprioritized. And because I didn't object, the dynamic solidified. I told myself I was choosing peace, that this was just how families worked, that not everything had to be equal to be fair. These explanations helped me stay functional, but they also kept me from asking a harder question. What happens when being understanding becomes a habit others rely on at your expense? By normalizing the imbalance, I was participating in it. Not consciously, not willingly, but effectively. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine doing anything different. Speaking up felt unnatural, almost selfish, as if I'd be breaking an unspoken agreement that I'd never formally agreed to, but had been living by for years. I didn't know it yet, but this normalization was laying the groundwork for something far more consequential. Because once disrespect feels normal, it takes something undeniable to finally expose it. And when that moment came, there would be no misunderstanding left to explain away. At some point, without anyone ever saying it out loud, my role in the family stopped being flexible. It settled into something fixed, defined, predictable. I was the reliable one, the problem solver, the person you didn't have to worry about. And once that role solidified, everything I did was interpreted through it. If I stayed quiet, it was maturity. If I handled things alone, it was independence. If I didn't ask for help, it was proof that I didn't need any. No one paused to ask whether any of that was a choice. The role came with expectations that were rarely stated, but always enforced. I was expected to understand when plans changed, to be patient when resources were limited, to be supportive without needing support in return. And because I met those expectations consistently, they became invisible. What I didn't see at first was how little room that role left for me to be human. When my brother struggled, it was framed as something happening to him. When I struggled, it was framed as something I would handle. The difference wasn't subtle once I noticed it. It was structural. I remember a conversation where my parents talked about the future, retirement plans, downsizing, what-ifs. They spoke openly about needing to make sure my brother was okay, that he had stability, that he wouldn't feel left behind. When my name came up, it was brief. "Charles will be fine," my father said. "He always is." Everyone nodded. That sentence wasn't meant to exclude me, it was meant to reassure. But it landed like a quiet erasure, as if my well-being required no consideration because it was assumed, guaranteed, automatic. I realized then that my role wasn't just about behavior, it was about perception. I wasn't seen as someone who might need help later. I was seen as a fixed outcome, a solved equation, and solved problems don't receive attention. The more I reflected on it, the more I saw how often this assumption guided decisions. When family responsibilities needed to be covered, I was the backup plan. When emotional labor was required, I was expected to provide it calmly. When compromise was needed, it usually came from my side, not because anyone demanded it, because it was assumed. I tried, briefly, to step outside that role. Not dramatically, just experimentally. I mentioned being overwhelmed once. I expressed hesitation about taking on an extra responsibility. The responses were subtle but telling. Surprise, mild confusion, reassurance that I had this. The underlying message was clear. This version of me didn't fit the role people were comfortable with, so I retreated. It was easier to return to the familiar shape than to insist on being seen differently. Easier to carry the weight quietly than to explain why it is heavy. But something shifted internally during that period. Not anger, awareness. I began to see my role not as an identity, but as an assignment. One that benefited others by simplifying them out of worry, but cost me visibility. I noticed how often I was thanked for being understanding, flexible, and reasonable. Words that sound positive until you realize they're often used to maintain imbalance. Appreciation became a substitute for care. And I accepted it for a while, because at the time, I still believed the role came with an unspoken safety net. That if things ever became truly difficult, if I ever genuinely needed help, the dynamic would adjust. That people would step up when it mattered. I didn't know yet how conditional that assumption was. What I didn't realize was that roles, once assigned, tend to persist even in moments that demand re-evaluation. And that the longer you play a part without protest, the more shocking it becomes when you finally stop. This role, reliable, invisible, adaptable, was shaping not just how others treated me, but how I treated myself. I began to measure my worth by how little I needed, how efficiently I absorbed discomfort, how smoothly I made things easier for everyone else. It took time for me to understand that this wasn't a strength. It was conditioning, and like all conditioning, it would eventually be tested. The day something shifted didn't arrive with drama. There was no argument, no raised voices, No moment where I finally said everything I'd been holding back. In fact, on the surface, it looked like an ordinary day. One of those quiet stretches of time where life feels manageable, even routine. That's why it took me a while to understand what had actually changed. I'd been dealing with the ongoing health issues for months by then. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but persistent enough to wear me down. Tests, appointments, procedures that were described as minor, but added up quickly, financially and emotionally. I kept working through it, adjusting my schedule, managing the discomfort the same way I managed everything else. Quietly. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I had savings, I had insurance, I had a plan. But plans have limits, and eventually I reached mine. The bills didn't arrive all at once. They came in waves, each one small enough to rationalize, until suddenly they weren't. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening, papers spread out in front of me, doing the math over and over as if the numbers might change if I stared at them long enough. That was the first time I seriously considered asking for help. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to. I didn't call my parents right away. I waited, thought it through, rehearsed how I'd explain the situation without sounding dramatic or irresponsible. I framed it carefully, the way I always did, emphasizing that I had a plan, that this wasn't ongoing, that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. When I finally did call, the conversation was calm, practical. I explained the situation. I shared the numbers. I asked if they could help cover part of the cost, just to get me through the next few months. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Longer than usual. Then my mother spoke. She said they didn't think they could. Things were tight, that they had to be careful. My father added that it wouldn't be responsible for them to step in right now. They weren't unkind. They didn't dismiss me outright. They just closed the door. I said I understood, and I meant it, at least in the moment. I thanked them for listening. We talked about something else. The call ended the way all our calls did. Pleasant, efficient, unresolved. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, and felt something unfamiliar. Not disappointment exactly, more like confirmation. A few days later, I found out about the car. It wasn't presented to me as news. It came up casually, in conversation, as if it were an obvious development. My brother needed something reliable. It made sense. They wanted him to feel supported. The purchase had happened quickly, decisively. The timing landed quietly, but the impact was anything but. I remember standing in my kitchen again, this time with nothing spread out in front of me, just space. And in that space, something finally aligned. The conversations, the assumptions, the role I'd been playing for years. This wasn't about money. It was about priorities. In that moment, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt clear. A kind of calm understanding that cut through years of rationalization. I saw, finally, that my stability had been mistaken for resilience without limits. That my silence had been interpreted as a capacity. That was when resources were finite. They flowed toward the person perceived as needing them most, not the person who asked least gracefully. Priorities became painfully clear. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't mention the timing. I didn't ask for explanations. There was nothing to argue about, because the truth didn't need defending. It had already been demonstrated. What shifted that day wasn't my relationship with my parents. It was my relationship with my expectations. I stopped assuming that being reliable would eventually be reciprocated. I stopped believing that fairness would naturally correct itself over time. And most importantly, I stopped waiting for someone else to notice when I needed something. That realization wasn't loud, but it was permanent. From that day on, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose. Not to punish, not to withdraw, but to observe, to recalibrate, to decide what kind of role, if any, I was willing to continue playing. And once that shift happens, there's no going back to the version of yourself who didn't see it. After that week, nothing changed on the surface. Phone calls still happened. Family gatherings still followed familiar rhythms. My parents asked how work was going. My brother talked about his plans, his progress, and his frustrations. From the outside, the family looked exactly the same as it always had. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. Before, my silence had been reactive. A habit formed from years of minimizing myself to keep things smooth. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I didn't announce this change. I didn't explain it to anyone, because an explanation would have implied I was asking for understanding. I wasn't. I was simply observing what happened when I stopped filling in the gaps automatically. I stopped volunteering updates unless I was asked directly. I stopped cushioning difficult truths with reassurance. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't explicitly expressed. Not in a cold way, not in a performative way, just neutrally. At first, no one noticed. That in itself was telling. When I used to smooth things over, it was invisible labor. When I stopped, the absence didn't register as loss. It registered as normal. My parents didn't check in anymore. My brother didn't ask if anything was different. The system adjusted without friction because it had never depended on my emotional presence in the first place. And that clarity, more than anything, confirmed the decision. Silence, I realized, has different meanings depending on who's interpreting it. When I stayed quiet before, it was assumed to mean everything is fine. When I stayed quiet now, it was still assumed to mean the same thing. The difference was that I no longer felt responsible for correcting that assumption. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how often conversations centered around reassurance, reassuring my brother, reassuring my parents that things were under control, reassuring everyone that the balance was intact. I noticed how rarely anyone asked questions that didn't already contain an answer. How are things going? Busy but fine, I'd say. And that would be enough. There was a strange relief in that. Not because I enjoyed withholding information, but because I finally understood that offering it had never changed the outcome. Silence stopped feeling like self-erasure and started feeling like self-preservation. Others, predictably, mistook it for weakness. They interpreted my calm as acceptance. My lack of reaction was agreement. The same traits that had once defined me now worked as camouflage. No one suspected I was reassessing anything. No one imagined I was making internal decisions that didn't include them. And that was the point. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't keeping score. I was simply stepping out of a role that required me to absorb imbalance quietly. Silence gave me space. Space to think, to evaluate, to decide what I owed and what I didn't. I started paying closer attention to my own life, my finances, my health, my long-term stability. I reviewed things I'd postponed out of convenience or habit, insurance details, legal documents, contingency plans I'd always assumed were unnecessary because family is there. I stopped assuming. This wasn't an act of a withdrawal, it was an act of grounding. I wasn't cutting anyone off. I was removing the expectation that I would always be available, always flexible, always fine. The most striking part was how little resistance there was. No one questioned my quiet. No one asked if something was wrong. Which told me everything I needed to know about how much emotional access they were accustomed to having, and how little they noticed when it changed. Silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It's space reclaimed. In that space, I began to see the contours of my life more clearly. Not as it was perceived, but as it actually functioned. Who showed up? Who assumed? Who benefited from my steadiness without contributing to it? And slowly, without urgency or drama, I began preparing for a version of my life that didn't rely on being the easy one. No announcements, no warnings, just quiet alignment between what I felt and how I acted. They thought nothing had changed. They were wrong. What they never noticed wasn't a single action or decision. It was a process. While everything looked the same from the outside, I was slowly reorienting my life in ways that didn't require permission or explanation. I wasn't hiding anything. I simply wasn't announcing it. And because no one was looking for change from me, none of it registered. I began with information. I reviewed every aspect of my financial situation with a level of attention I'd never given it before. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. I listed assets, liabilities, and obligations. I looked at how vulnerable I actually was if something went wrong again, and how much of my security was built on assumptions rather than safeguards. I realized that part of the reason the medical bills had shaken me wasn't just the cost. It was the realization that I'd unconsciously counted on family support as a backstop. Not as a guarantee, but as a possibility. That assumption had been quietly removed, and I hadn't noticed until it mattered. So I replaced it. I adjusted my savings strategy, increased my emergency fund beyond what I'd once considered sufficient. I re-evaluated insurance coverage, opting for higher premiums in exchange for lower exposure. I paid attention to details I'd previously waved away as probably fine. No one noticed. I also began documenting things. Not obsessively, not defensively, just carefully. Expenses, health records, conversations that involved commitments or expectations. I didn't do this because I expected conflict. I did it because clarity requires evidence, even if it's only for yourself. For years, I'd relied on memory and good faith. Now, I rely on structure. At work, I applied the same mindset. I took note of how often I stepped in to solve problems that weren't technically mine. How frequently my reliability was used as a buffer for inefficiencies elsewhere. I didn't stop being competent, but I stopped being automatically available. I let small gaps appear. Nothing broke. Nothing collapsed. In fact, the system adjusted. Others picked up responsibility when I didn't preemptively take it. The world didn't end, and that too was instructive. I started investing in skills I'd postponed developing because they weren't immediately necessary. Long-term planning tools. Advanced certifications. Knowledge that wouldn't make me more visible, but would make me more autonomous. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was building options. Options change how you see everything. Socially, I became more selective. Not distant, intentional. I noticed which relationships felt reciprocal and which relied on me being the stabilizing force. I invested more time in the former and gently disengaged from the latter. Again, no one noticed. That was the most telling part of all of it. My withdrawal from certain patterns didn't create alarms because my presence had never been perceived as essential, only convenient. At home, I reorganized my living space in ways that reflected permanence rather than flexibility. I replaced things I'd kept good enough out of habit. I made decisions that assumed I would be the primary person responsible for my future without contingency plans involving anyone else. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Every step reinforced the same conclusion. I didn't need to announce my independence. I needed to operationalize it, and the more I did, the less resentment I felt. Preparation replaced frustration. Structure replaced expectation. I stopped mentally negotiating with people who weren't aware that a negotiation was happening. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from knowing you're not waiting on anyone anymore. The people around me still saw the same version of me they always had. The steady one, the quiet one, the reliable one. They didn't see the shift because it didn't disrupt their experience. It only changed mine. That invisibility, which had once felt like a loss, became an advantage. I could build without interference. I could decide without debate. I could prepare without being told I was overthinking. They never noticed the way my questions changed, the way my timelines extended, the way my decisions stopped factoring in hypothetical support. And I didn't correct their perception, because for the first time, it was working in my favor. What they never noticed was that I was no longer orienting my life around the role they'd assigned me. I was building something quieter, sturdier, and entirely my own. And once that foundation was in place, it revealed something else. Something I hadn't been looking for, but couldn't ignore once I saw it. A form of leverage that didn't involve confrontation, just clarity. The reveal didn't come with excitement. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. If anything, it arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, the way truth often does when you stop distracting yourself long enough to see it. I wasn't looking for leverage. I wasn't trying to gain an upper hand over anyone. I was simply doing what I'd learned to do best. Examining systems, identifying dependencies, understanding how things actually worked, rather than how they were assumed to work. And that's when I saw it. It happened while I was reviewing documents related to my parents' long-term plans. Nothing secret, nothing hidden from me intentionally. Over the years, they'd mentioned things casually, retirement timelines, downsizing, health considerations. Because I was good with details, they'd occasionally ask my opinion, forward paperwork, and request help understanding options. I had always treated that involvement as support, by helping them think things through. This time I saw it differently. I noticed how often I was listed as the point of contact. How frequently my name appeared in places that assumed reliability, continuity, and availability. Emergency contact, executor discussions, informal assurances about handling things if needed. It wasn't malicious, it was practical. They trusted me, but trust, I realized, had been unevenly applied. While I had been excluded from support when I needed it, I was implicitly included in responsibility when they anticipated future needs. I wasn't asked whether I wanted that role. It was assumed, just as my self-sufficiency always had been. Seeing it laid out that way created a strange stillness inside me. For years, I'd believed the dynamic was one-directional, that I was simply the low-priority one. But what I was actually seeing was a quieter form of reliance, one that didn't come with emotional investment, but came with expectation. I was the contingency plan. The realization wasn't empowering, it was sobering, because it meant that the family system wasn't balanced around care. It was balanced around function. My brother was supported because he was perceived as vulnerable. I was relied upon because I was perceived as capable. Both roles served the system, but only one was nurtured. And the system assumed my continued participation. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power over anyone, but that my absence, my non-participation, would change things in ways people hadn't considered. Not out of spite, out of structure. I sat with that understanding for a long time. I didn't act on it immediately. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even adjust my behavior right away. I needed to be sure I wasn't reacting emotionally. I needed to separate clarity from resentment. So I asked myself hard questions. Was I willing to continue being the reliable endpoint for plans that didn't include my needs? Was I comfortable carrying responsibility that came with expectation, but not support? Was I choosing this role? Or had I simply never questioned it? The answers came slowly, but they were consistent. I wasn't angry at my parents. I wasn't trying to punish them. But I also wasn't willing to keep playing a role that assumed my capacity without acknowledging my limits. The leverage wasn't something I could use aggressively. It wasn't something to be wielded. It was something to be acknowledged internally, so I could decide where I stood. For the first time, I understood that opting out was an option. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because once you see how systems depend on you, you have to decide whether your participation is intentional or automatic. I reviewed everything again, this time with that lens. What assumptions were being made about my availability, about my willingness, about my silence? And I began quietly disentangling myself from roles that had never been explicitly chosen. I updated the documents, clarified boundaries, redirected points of contact where appropriate, not dramatically, not defensively, just accurately. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't explain them. I simply aligned reality with my actual capacity. The reveal didn't change how I saw my family. It changed how I saw myself within it. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't powerless. I had simply been unacknowledged in ways that benefited others. And acknowledgement, once internalized, changes how you move. From that point on, every decision became simpler, not easier, but clearer. Because I was no longer operating under unspoken expectations. I was choosing, and that meant that a decision point was coming, one that couldn't be deferred forever. Once you see a decision coming, you can't pretend it isn't there. For a while, I lived in the space just before it, aware, prepared, but not yet committed. Everything I'd learned had clarified my position, but clarity doesn't automatically tell you what to do with itself. It only removes the excuse of ignorance. I knew I couldn't keep things exactly as they were, but I also knew I didn't want to act out of bitterness or urgency. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about choosing a future I could live with, honestly. There were several options in front of me. I could confront my parents directly, lay everything out, explain how the timing of the medical bills and the car purchase had affected me, ask for acknowledgement, maybe even an apology. That path promised emotional release, but it also relied on something I no longer wanted to depend on, their capacity to understand me in the way I needed. I could continue as I had been, quietly reliable, quietly resentful, quietly prepared. That path was familiar, comfortable in a way. It required the least disruption, but it also required me to keep absorbing a dynamic I'd already outgrown. Or I could do something simpler and harder. I could change my participation, not through withdrawal or punishment, not by cutting anyone off, but by redefining what I was available for, without debate or explanation. By aligning my actions with my values instead of my role. That was the irreversible option. Once you stop showing up automatically, people notice eventually. And once you stop filling a space others assumed would always be occupied, it changes the shape of the system around you. You can't undo that kind of shift, not because it's dramatic, but because it's structural. I spent weeks thinking it through. I paid attention to how I felt after conversations, not what was said, but what was assumed. I noticed how often I was included in plans without being consulted, how frequently was my agreement implied rather than requested, and I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. If I weren't seen as the strong one, would these expectations still exist? The answer was clear. So I made a decision, not all at once, but decisively. I chose to stop being the default. I didn't announce it. I didn't frame it as a boundary conversation. I simply began responding differently. When asked to commit to future responsibilities, I asked for time to consider. When assumptions were made about my availability, I clarified them calmly. When plans included me without discussion, I adjusted them to reflect my actual capacity. No anger, No explanation beyond what was necessary. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like breaking an unspoken rule. There was a part of me that expected pushback, confusion, maybe even guilt. But what I encountered instead was hesitation, small pauses where people recalculated because the equation had changed. And that hesitation told me I'd chosen correctly. The decision wasn't about distancing myself emotionally. It was about refusing to participate in a dynamic that treated my stability as infinite. I was still present, still kind, still engaged, just no longer automatic. That distinction mattered more than I'd expected, because once I made it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: alignment. My actions matched my internal understanding. I wasn't suppressing discomfort or waiting for validation. I was simply acting in accordance with what I knew to be true. I also accepted that this choice might not be understood. That was part of its finality. When you stop explaining yourself, you give up the illusion of being seen the way you wish to be seen. In exchange, you gain the reality of being honest about what you will and won't do. The decision point wasn't dramatic. It didn't change everything overnight. But it marked the end of something important. The version of me who believed that patience alone would eventually lead to balance. From here on, things would change, not because I demanded they do so, but because I no longer upheld the structure that kept them static. And once that structure shifts, consequences follow, not as punishment, but as cause and effect. Quietly, inevitably. After the decision was made, the work became procedural, not emotional, not symbolic, just precise. I didn't frame what I was doing as pulling away. I thought of it as recalibrating inputs and outputs. If expectations had been built on assumptions, then the only way to correct them was through consistent, observable behavior, not explanation. So I moved quietly. The first changes were administrative. I updated beneficiaries, clarified contingencies, removed vague placeholders like "family will handle it" from plans that required certainty. Where I had once left things open-ended out of trust, I now closed loops intentionally. No one noticed. I streamlined my finances further, consolidating accounts and automating safeguards. I shifted money into structures that prioritized long-term resilience over short-term flexibility. I wasn't planning to disappear or detach. I was planning to be self-contained. That distinction mattered to me. When family conversations turned to future planning, I listened more than I spoke. When my opinion was requested, I gave it. Clearly, narrowly, without volunteering to manage or execute anything. I stopped translating complexity into comfort for others. If something required effort, I let that effort remain visible. At work, the shift became more apparent, but still not dramatic. I declined additional responsibilities that weren't aligned with my role. I documented boundaries the way I documented processes, neutrally, thoroughly, without justification beyond accuracy. When colleagues adjusted, I let them. When they didn't, I corrected assumptions calmly. Again, nothing broke. The most noticeable change was internal. I no longer felt a low-grade tension before interactions. I wasn't scanning conversations for what I'd need to absorb or fix afterward. I wasn't preloading explanations in case someone was disappointed. I showed up as I was, not as what smoothed things out. My parents continued to operate under familiar assumptions for a while. They talked about the future as if I'd naturally be involved. I didn't contradict them immediately, but I didn't reinforce those ideas either. When specifics came up, I asked clarifying questions. What are you planning for that? Who's handling that? Have you confirmed that arrangement? Questions create accountability without confrontation. My brother, too, carried on as usual. He shared updates, accepted support, made plans with the confidence of someone who assumed the structure beneath him would hold. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn him. I didn't step in to balance things behind the scenes the way I once might have. Not because I wanted him to fail, but because I no longer believed it was my role to compensate. This period required discipline. There were moments when stepping in would have been easier, familiar. There were times when I could have smoothed over confusion with a single reassuring sentence. I chose not to. Moving in silence isn't passive. It requires restraint. It means resisting the urge to prove you're still capable. It means letting people experience the consequences of their assumptions at a manageable scale, rather than shielding them indefinitely. The silence wasn't cold. It was clean. I wasn't withholding affection or care. I was withholding automatic compliance. And that distinction allowed me to stay present without being consumed. Slowly, the system began to register the change, not consciously, not all at once, but through small friction points, delays, unanswered questions, tasks that lingered because no one had defaulted to solving them. Still, No one named it. They felt something was different, but couldn't quite say what. That's the nature of moving in silence. When you don't announce your exit from a role, people don't realize you've left it until they reach for you and find the space empty. By the time they noticed, the structure had already adjusted. And the version of me that once held it together quietly was no longer available in the same way. I didn't feel guilt, I felt grounded, because for the first time, I wasn't preparing for other people's futures at the expense of my own. I was already living inside the one I'd chosen. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived in confusion. At first it was subtle. A missed detail here, a delay there. Small things that used to resolve themselves without anyone noticing how or why. The kind of things that for years I would have quietly stepped in to fix before they ever became visible. Now they lingered. My parents started mentioning minor stresses in passing, paperwork that felt overwhelming, timelines that didn't quite line up, decisions that seemed harder than they expected. Nothing dramatic, just an undercurrent of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. I listened. I didn't rush to reassure. When they asked questions, I answered them. When they hinted at needing help, I asked what kind of help they were referring to. Specifics matter. And suddenly, things that had once been assumed required articulation. That shift alone changed the tone. At one point, my mother mentioned how complicated everything felt lately, how she thought things would be simpler by now. I nodded and said I understood, and I did. I just didn't interpret understanding as stepping in to take over. My brother felt it too, though differently. The support he'd grown accustomed to didn't disappear, but it slowed. Not because my parents withdrew it intentionally, but because they were managing more themselves. The system had less elasticity, less unseen reinforcement. He began expressing frustration about delays, about logistics, about how things seemed harder than they should be. I listened the way I always had, calm, attentive. But I didn't translate that frustration into solutions. I noticed something then that stayed with me. When support is structural rather than explicit, its absence feels like neglect, even when no one has actually changed their behavior. They felt a loss, but they couldn't locate it. That was the most difficult part to witness, not because I felt responsible, but because I could see how invisible my role had always been. They didn't miss me. They missed the function I'd quietly performed. And functions, when removed, don't generate gratitude. They generate disruption. There were moments when I could see the questions forming, unspoken. Why does this feel harder? Why isn't this smoother? Why didn't someone think of this? Those questions used to point in my direction automatically. Now, they floated unresolved. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. There was no dramatic fallout, just a gradual recognition that things weren't aligning the way they used to, and an unspoken sense that something had shifted. I stayed steady through all of it. Not distant, not defensive, just present without overfunctioning. That distinction mattered more than any explanation could have. The hardest moment came when my parents expressed worry, not about me, but about the future. About how things would be handled if circumstances changed suddenly. About whether their plans were realistic. I listened carefully. For years, I would have absorbed that worry and turned it into reassurance. I would have said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." I would have smoothed over the uncertainty before it had a chance to fully surface. This time I didn't. I said, "It sounds like you have a lot to think through." And I meant it. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was heavy. Because for the first time, they were sitting with the full weight of their own assumptions, without my presence buffering it. That was when I understood something important. Consequences don't require confrontation. They only require consistency. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. I wasn't hoping they'd realize something specific. I was simply no longer compensating for a system that relied on me without recognizing me. And systems notice that eventually, not through emotion, but through friction, through the slow accumulation of small inconveniences that reveal how much had been quietly handled before. Through the realization that easy had never been inherent, it had been maintained. As these consequences unfolded, I felt something unexpected, relief. Not satisfied, not vindication, relief. Because I was no longer carrying responsibilities that weren't mine by choice. I wasn't bracing myself for needs that hadn't been voiced. I wasn't silently managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own. They were beginning to feel the gap. And soon, they would try to close it. By the time they tried to fix it, the shape of things had already changed. That's the part people rarely understand. They assume repair works the same way damage does, that if you notice a problem early enough, you can reverse it with the right words, the right gestures, the right intentions. But some shifts don't break anything outright. They simply move the center of gravity. And once that happens, nothing returns to its original position. The first signs of panic were subtle. My parents started asking more questions than usual, not logistical ones, relational ones. How are you doing? Whether I felt overwhelmed. Whether work had been stressful. The tone was careful, almost tentative, like they were probing for information without knowing exactly what they were looking for. I answered honestly. What? But narrowly. I said I was managing, that I was focused on my own stability. I had a lot on my plate, but it was intentional. Those answers didn't reassure them the way they once might have. They also began offering help, belatedly, vaguely. If you ever need anything, let us know if we can support you. Statements that floated without structure or follow-through. Invitations without commitment. I heard them clearly for what they were, attempts to restore balance without re-examining the system that had required it. There was a moment when my mother mentioned the medical bills. Not directly, just in passing. She said she'd been thinking about that time, about how hard it must have been. There was regret in her voice, maybe even guilt. I acknowledged it, I didn't minimize it, but I didn't reopen the conversation either. Because by then, it wasn't about that week anymore. It was about everything that had followed. They wanted reassurance that I wasn't pulling away. Those things were still okay. That the family structure was intact. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't withdrawing emotionally, I was withdrawing structurally. And that kind of change doesn't respond to apologies alone. My brother sensed it too. He became more attentive, more curious. He asked questions he'd never asked before. About my plans, my boundaries, whether I'd be around for certain things. There was confusion in his voice. I didn't blame him for that. He was navigating a system that had quietly shifted beneath him, without explanation. And like my parents, he was trying to restore a familiar equilibrium without fully understanding what had made it unstable. They all wanted to fix something, but no one could name it, because naming it would have required acknowledging that my reliability had been used as infrastructure rather than appreciated as a choice. And that realization is uncomfortable, especially when it isn't rooted in malice. There were attempts at closeness, invitations, gestures that might have felt meaningful years earlier. I accepted some, declined others. Not out of punishment, but because my capacity had changed, and I wasn't willing to override it to soothe someone else's anxiety. The hardest part wasn't their regret. It was watching them realize, slowly, that the version of me they were trying to re-engage no longer existed. Not because I'd become cold or distant, but because I'd become honest with myself. At one point, my father said something that crystallized it for me. He said, "We didn't know you felt this way. You never said anything." And he was right. I hadn't. But what he didn't say, and maybe couldn't, was that I hadn't been asked in a way that made space for a different answer. My silence had been convenient, and convenience, once relied upon, becomes expectation. I didn't argue that point. There was nothing to win by doing so. I simply said, "I'm taking care of things differently now." That was all. They wanted timelines, reassurance, proof that this was temporary. I couldn't give them that, because the change wasn't reactive. It was foundational. It wasn't that they were too late to care. They were too late to assume the system they'd relied on, quietly, unconsciously, had already been dismantled. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. And rebuilding it would have required a level of awareness and redistribution of responsibility that no one was prepared to undertake. So the discomfort remained. Not explosive, not dramatic, just unresolved. And in that unresolved space, something irreversible became clear. Relationships don't end only when people leave. Sometimes they end when expectations no longer have somewhere to land. What they wanted was restoration. What had already happened was a transformation, and that difference couldn't be negotiated away. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no emotional spillover, no rehearsed speeches. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, during a visit that had no stated purpose beyond catching up. That, in itself, was fitting. The most important shifts in this story never announced themselves loudly. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Coffee had gone cold. The conversation had wandered through safe territory, weather, work, minor updates, until it reached a natural pause. My mother was the one who broke it. She asked carefully why things felt different. Not accusatory, not defensive, just uncertain. I took a moment before answering. Not because I needed to compose myself, but because I wanted to be precise. Precision mattered more than emotion now. I told them that I hadn't stopped caring, that I wasn't angry, that I wasn't pulling away to make a point. I explained that I had realized, slowly, over time, that I'd been operating under expectations I never agreed to, and that continuing to meet them was no longer sustainable for me. They listened, really listened, and that was new, my father asked when this had started. I told him it wasn't one moment, but I also didn't avoid naming the week when it became undeniable. The medical bills, the refusal, the car. I stated it plainly, without emphasis. I understood your decision, I said. What changed for me was understanding what it meant. There was silence after that. Not uncomfortable. Processing silence. My mother said they hadn't realized how much I'd needed help. That they assumed I was okay because I always seemed okay. That they thought they were being fair. I believed her, and that was the strange thing. Believing her didn't undo anything. It just clarified that intention and impact don't cancel each other out. I told them I didn't expect apologies or explanations. What mattered to me now was alignment. That I needed my involvement in future plans to be based on choice, not assumption. That I would help when I could, not because it was expected, but because it made sense for everyone involved. No ultimatums, no demands, just facts. My brother spoke then. He said he hadn't known how things looked from my side, that he'd never thought about how often support flowed toward him without question. He wasn't defensive, just unsettled. I didn't ask him to feel guilty. I told him it wasn't about comparison. It was about patterns, and my decision to stop absorbing them quietly. What struck me most was how calm I felt. Not detached, not numb, just steady. This wasn't a release of pent-up emotion, it was a statement of position. They asked what this meant going forward. I answered honestly. It meant fewer assumptions, more clarity, slower decisions. And I'm prioritizing my own stability without apology. They didn't push back. I think they sensed that this wasn't a negotiation. Not because I was inflexible, but because I was no longer operating from a place that needed approval. The confrontation ended the same way it began, quietly. No dramatic resolution, no promises of sweeping change, just an understanding that something fundamental had been named and that naming it had altered the landscape. As I left that day, I didn't feel relief or triumph. I felt complete, because for the first time, I had spoken without asking to be understood. I had explained without defending. And I had listened without absorbing responsibility that wasn't mine. That was the confrontation, and it didn't burn anything down. It simply clarified where I stood. Who I am now isn't dramatically different from who I was before. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still reliable in the ways that matter. But the difference is internal, and it changes everything. I no longer confuse reliability with obligation. I no longer measure my worth by how little I need or how much I can absorb. That shift didn't make me harder, it made it clearer. I still speak with my parents regularly. Our relationship didn't collapse, it recalibrated. Conversations are more deliberate now, less assumed. When they ask for help, they ask directly. When I offer support, it's because I've chosen to, not because it's expected. There's more respect in that exchange, even when it's quieter. My brother and I have a different relationship too. Not closer in the way people often mean, but more honest. He's more aware of the support he receives. I'm more aware of the limits I need. We don't compare. We coexist with clearer boundaries. And that clarity has removed a kind of tension I didn't realize I'd been carrying. The most significant changes, though, are in how I live my own life. I plan differently now. I don't assume safety nets that aren't explicit. I build redundancy into my finances, my healthcare, my time. I make decisions as if I am fully responsible for the outcomes, because I am. That responsibility doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels accurate. I also allow myself to be seen in smaller, more intentional ways. Not everywhere, not with everyone, but with people who show up reciprocally. I don't over-explain my limits. I state them and let them stand. There's a quiet confidence in that. I no longer rush to smooth discomfort, mine or anyone else's. I've learned that discomfort isn't a failure of character. It's often a signal that something needs attention. And I trust myself to respond to those signals now, rather than override them for the sake of harmony. I don't feel bitterness toward my family. I don't replay old moments or tally what was given versus what wasn't. That accounting ended the moment I stopped participating in the imbalance. Forgiveness, for me, didn't come from forgetting. It came from no longer needing things to be different in order to move forward. I'm not the easy one anymore. Not because I've become difficult, but because I've become intentional. People still see me as steady. But now, that steadiness belongs to me first. If I offer help, it's real. If I say no, it's final. If I'm present, it's chosen. That alignment has changed how I experience everything. Work, family, silence. Even solitude feels different when it isn't carrying an unspoken obligation. I used to think strength meant not needing anything. Now I know it means knowing exactly what you're willing to carry and what you're not. Who I am now is someone who understands that love isn't proven by endurance. It's proven by mutual regard. And when that regard isn't there, the most honest thing you can do is stop pretending it is. That understanding didn't make my world smaller. It made it stable. And stability, when it's chosen rather than imposed, feels like freedom. There's a temptation, when a story reaches its end, to look for a verdict, to decide who was right and who was wrong, who failed, who should apologize, who deserves understanding. But that kind of ending would miss the point of what actually happened here. This story isn't about villains. It's about patterns. It's about how families, often without realizing it, assign roles that feel efficient in the moment and quietly expensive over time. How one person becomes the strong one, not because they volunteered, but because they adapted early. And how that adaptation, once rewarded, turns into expectation. What I learned is this. Being dependable can make you invisible if you're not careful. Not because people don't care, but because they stop checking. They assume your strength is infinite. They mistake your silence for comfort. And over time, they build systems around that assumption. Until one day, the system asks more than you can give. My parents didn't wake up one morning deciding to value me less. My brother didn't take something that was meant for me. What happened was quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. My needs didn't register as urgent because I didn't express them urgently. And when I finally did, they collided with priorities that had already been set. That week, the medical bills, the refusal, the new car, wasn't the cause of everything. It was the evidence. The moment when all the rationalization stopped working, when priorities became painfully clear, not through words, but through action. And once you see that kind of clarity, you can't unsee it. What came after wasn't revenge or withdrawal. It was alignment. I stopped participating in a role that required me to overextend quietly. I stopped waiting for recognition that might never come, and I stopped assuming that patience alone would eventually turn into fairness. That choice didn't destroy my relationships, it changed them. Some connections grew quieter. Some became more respectful. Some revealed limits I hadn't wanted to acknowledge before. But all of them became more honest. And honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is less exhausting than performance. If there's a moral here, it isn't cut people off or never help your family. It's simpler and harder than that. Don't confuse your ability to endure with your obligation to do so. Being capable doesn't mean being expendable. Being calm doesn't mean being unaffected. And being reliable doesn't mean you should always be the one who adjusts. Strength that is never chosen becomes a burden. Strength that is chosen becomes agency. I didn't lose my family. I lost an illusion that if I just stayed quiet long enough, balance would eventually find me on its own. It doesn't work that way. Balance has to be claimed. Sometimes without argument, sometimes without permission, often without anyone fully understanding it except you. And that's okay. So I'll leave you with this. Not as advice, just as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever been this person everyone depends on, and quietly realized that no one is depending on how you are doing? If so, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments.